Hey, this is the Entertainment Advice Channel. What I want to talk about today is a question of, is materialism ruining music? Now, when it comes to this particular topic, which of course is a very controversial topic for different reasons, you know, this particular topic, what we will be talking about today, specifically related to this topic, out of all the different topics to talk about, is materialism ruining music because it is simply talking about the same thing over and over again. Or in other words, it just makes people talk about the same thing over and over again, which gets boring. So I'm going to talk about that today. Is materialism ruining music or is it not ruining music? So now I mentioned that, let's get started. So when it comes to the topic of is materialism ruining music, my simple answer to that question straightforward is no. I don't believe materialism is ruining music. Because when it comes to music genres like rap, you can even say reggaeton, pop music, but particularly rap. Um, a big criticism that they tend to get all the time is that it's too materialistic. They just talk about living the high life and this and that and so on and so forth, and you know it kind of gets old and boring and it just kind of causes problems and so on and so forth, but mostly, particularly, it gets boring because they just talk about the same thing over and over and over again. But a simple answer to that question is that even though I can imagine it can get tiresome, the truth of the matter is, I don't think the problem is materialism, okay? Materialism is not ruining music. It's just simply down to bad writers that are ruining music because they decide to talk about the same freaking thing over and over and over again. Which actually, for music in general, you can have it go from any extreme, just like emo music in 2000s. All they talk about was depressing shit, which is actually the reason why it lost popularity. Or it could be, for example, maybe, pop music, or pop, I mean, like EDM. It just talks about dancing all the time. Like, that can get kind of boring. So the truth of the matter is, blaming it on any one particular thing, was materialism or this and that, is simply false, because all it really comes down to in the end of the day is simply bad writing or something, and if you have people who run the place and they just want to talk about the same thing, that's more on them than it's about materialism, because the purpose of materialism when it comes to music and music in particular, especially when you see music videos and stuff, is that it's supposed to tell a good story, or at least in general, for that matter, make a story more entertaining, for that matter, okay? Because because what when it comes to anyone who's familiar with things like this, maybe this is something you studied in school, or even for that matter, maybe you can even go as far as to say, you actually, of course, for that matter, work on it in life and stuff. There's something when it comes to telling stories and so on and so forth, whatever you like to say, known as character development. Character development is extremely important when you are writing a story for something, okay? Especially a narrative, like a character, which in the case of a musical artist, you're telling us, you're having a narrative for that particular character, okay? And when you have a narrative for that particular character, you want to have something that makes it more interesting. If someone is just talking all the time about being on the bottom and not going anywhere, that can get boring over time. But to hear a character who talks about being at the bottom and then he rises to the top, it makes it more interesting and entertaining. Because in general, for that matter, it creates a situation where it makes things more enjoyable, okay, for that matter, okay? It makes things more enjoyable because it tells a narrative. It's a more interesting story. It's a compelling story of hearing someone who comes from the absolute bottom to then rise into the top and now has all these sorts of things. It makes it more interesting because there's higher to go, for that matter. Not to mention, it gives you a lot more creative liberties to make it possible for you to come up with interesting things to talk about instead of just talking about relationships, which can get mad boring, or of course talking about street shit, which aside from high life is the only thing that can really make a story interesting, for that matter, for that matter, if you can't, if you, for that matter, pretty much. So if you want to have something that's has a good selling point, you want to talk about luxury, you want to talk about high living, you want to talk about all that stuff. If you're not, if you don't want to just specifically talk about gang related shit and all that type of stuff, whether it's rap or reggaeton and all that type of stuff. So that's my point here, for that matter, okay? Is that that's why they have to do that, okay? And even for other genres that might not, that might talk about luxury living and they don't have to deal with that particular issue of talking about crime. It could be the same thing too. Not everyone just wants to hear songs about dancing and all that stuff. Some people want something that's interesting. Since most people's lives, let's be honest, are boring anyway, they want something that's going to sell a fantasy and make life seem more interesting and entertaining than it actually might then not might actually be than it actually is for most people. So that's the truth of the matter. You have to have a selling point, and selling something higher is obviously way more able to make a more interesting and compelling story than telling someone who just talks about relatable stuff all the time, because that can get boring over time. So the truth of the matter, materialism does not ruin music, it's just simply down to bad writers, okay? And a lot of these big companies and stuff have terrible writers. They just talk about the same thing, and a lot of them don't even probably, even write their own shit. They use AI to do things for them. So that's the reason why it's like that. So the problem is not necessarily about materialism. The problem is just simply down to bad writers, okay? Who just talk about the same thing over and over again. In other words, repetition, okay? Or more specifically, oversaturation. So if there's a greater balance between talking about high life living to maybe talking about different particular topics, whether it could be dancing, partying, or whatnot, or just different things for that matter, then it will be way more interesting and entertaining and no one will be complaining. In the 1990s, they had a really good balance between these different topics. No one was complaining about materialism back then. You know, for the most part at least. So it's not materialism, and obviously common sense can also indicate if you don't like hearing music about materialism, then you don't have to listen to it. You can find something that relates more to you. So the truth of the matter is blaming everything on materialism doesn't make any sense. It's stupid, it's dumb, it's oversaturated, and it doesn't really matter in all honesty. What it really comes down to is simply a it just simply comes down to good writers. So to answer your question in short, is materialism ruining music? No. As the truth of the matter is, it just comes down to the quality of the writers of the music that's out there. Okay, that's simply the truth of the matter. It has nothing to do with materialism. We have people have been talking about materialism for the longest time since the 1980s, 1990s. We didn't have a problem. So it's not materialism in short. It's just oversaturation. So that's hopefully answers your question. So anyway, this is my video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it informative. And if you like this video and videos like this, remember to thumbs this video up and hit the subscribe button. And this is off the saying. Simply put it on out. So bye.